Attention, action this day. You are listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, and it's a Dunkirk week PS edition. We are delighted to be joined. I mean, this is quite extraordinary, really, because we've spoken to academics, historians, experts, and to each other at great length, but we haven't actually spoken to someone who, well, Ethel, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on We Have Ways. Now, I'll leave it to you. Why are we talking to you about the Dunkirk evacuation?
Because I was there right from the beginning of the war at the Burntwood Military Hospital, where we had the first convoy back to this country after the Dunkirk fiasco. And because I'd signed to say that I would, if there was a war, I would join the Civil Nursing Reserve, which meant I would have to go to a military hospital. And the nearest hospital to where I lived was Burntwood Hospital. The military hospital was built in the grounds of St Matthew's Psychiatric Hospital and built especially for the war and just finished in time. For over a year, when we knew there would probably be a war, I joined the St John Ambulance Brigade and became qualified in all the different things, first aid, home nursing, and then I was then a VAD, which was a nurse, not fully trained, so that there was a first aid post in every village, and so I was able to work in the first aid posts as a junior nurse, more or less, and then the war started.
So, Ethel, I know it's rude to ask a lady how old she is, but how old were you then, back in 1939?
I was 18.
18 in 1939, goodness.
Yes.
And there was very definitely, though, a feeling that war was coming. There was sort of no doubt about it.
We'd been preparing for war for, some time, a long time before. Everything was, air raid shelters were being built. There was Dad's army marching up and down the street, practising with the brushes, and the crowds of children following them along the streets. It was quite a sight to see. And we learned how to deal with the gas injuries or anything like that. And so there's quite a lot to do beforehand. We were and then with the St John Ambulance we were training all the time. And as it happened, my husband was the lecturer.
Oh.
But he wasn't my husband then.
No.
I didn't really know him then. He was just a lecturer.
And so when war began, you were put on, you were on a readiness, I suppose, footing for casualties to come back. And then, of course, the war starts, but there's no fighting in Europe. So
no.
Was there a sense of anticipation that work was going to start, or a kind of phony sense?
Everybody knew that war was evident, So when the war started, I enrolled at Burntwood Military Hospital because that was where I wanted to go. But I went there, but of course the hospital was empty then, and I'd been there for about 2 weeks when they started bringing in patients, but they were all civilian patients because already there was bombing in Birmingham just starting, and the patients were from the hospitals around Birmingham, and they sent them to Burntwood for safety because it was in the country, you see. So we had them until we had the convoy. When we had the first convoy, and that was on May the 27th, 1940, all the civilian patients were sent to other places, other hospitals, so that the hospital was empty for that time. We only had about 2 days' notice. And then this one day, I'd better tell you about the wards first. There were 7 Nissen huts, which held 40 beds in each ward. They were the wards for the men, and the officers had wards in the main building, which belonged to the psychiatric hospital, but it was loaned to us for the war. This night, when we were told to be on duty early, we worked 12-hour shifts, and we got to be on duty early that morning. And we were all there, and we saw the convoy coming along up the hill towards the hospital. There were buses, lorries, all sorts of things, and bringing the men from Dunkirk. And when they started unloading all these vehicles, some of the men were already dead. All the wards were filled, and I was on Hut 7, as we called it. It was mostly fractures and, all sorts of things. We didn't know what they were. But all the men, when we tried to get them into bed, we found that their uniforms were still damp. What they'd done had been picked up, got away from Dunkirk. They'd been sent to Cosford, and from there they'd been distributed all over the Midlands in the different convoys, and we had about 100 soldiers then from the British Expeditionary Force, and they were our first patients. But most of the uniforms had to be cut from them because they were still covered with blood and mud and in a terrible state. Just been used to normal wards with perhaps pneumonia and coughs and things like that, and heart attacks and everything. Just normal illnesses. And then seeing them like that, and some of them, they couldn't speak, they were, all exhausted, there were broken bones, arms hanging off, and it was such a shock. And I remember when we went to bed that night, we were in a ward, 4 beds in a ward, and we were all so exhausted after seeing them, and really upset because to see all those men, in such a distressed state. But anyway, we got them all into bed, and I must tell you though, where we lived, discipline was very strict at the hospital, and in this building, which was a big house in the middle of the fields, because there were fields all around us, no men were allowed. So it was jokingly called by everybody the Virgin's Retreat. Because no men were allowed in. But
so when the first casualties come, and then do they just keep coming? There's just more men, and there's very much a sense that the BEF are leaving France in a hurry, or was that all you saw of the? Did it carry on then for a week or so?
Yes. Oh, it carried on for 4 years.
Of course.
The hospital. Yes, it was very distressing to see them all like that, So we just had to nurse them as best we knew. As well as the Nissen huts for the men, which were the wards, there were operating theatres, and there were Nissen huts for the day nurses to sleep in. Of course, after we treated those patients, it was only about 2 weeks before the next lot came. Some of them had got better, and a lot of them were really, ill patients, and they had to have bandages all over them. In the next lot of patients, who were the very ill ones, who they didn't think would live, there was one man who I eventually got in touch with, not the patient, but his son. And his son came from Blackburn. His father was at Dunkirk, and he was on the beach, and they'd just left him, as though they were all fleeing to the sea. He was left on the beach because they thought he was just dying. As it happened, a Catholic priest was walking by and gave him the last rites, and left him there on a stretcher on the sands in Dunkirk. All the others fleeing to the sea with the boats waiting for them. And his name was Frank Nolan. He was just lying there on the beach on his stretcher. He'd had nothing to eat for days, And then 2 French soldiers saw him there, and they were fleeing to the beach also. And they took him on a stretcher to the beach and managed to get him onto a little boat and then to a hospital ship. That was where he ended up. And so he was brought back to Burntwood, where I was put in special nursing for him because he was, well, they weren't expecting him to live. He'd gone without food, just lying on his stretcher on the beach. He was dying. He was put in the ward, and they traced his family, and his wife came to see him. She asked, if she could come in and see him into the ward, and she was told where he was. She went all round the ward, and she came back and said she couldn't find him. And he was so badly injured, he was all bandaged up, and he was so ill, she just couldn't recognise him. Anyway, he lived for 41 years after he recovered. And so I was in charge of him for, until he was beginning to get better. And it was wonderful to know that he did get better because he was so injured. Well, nobody ever thought he would live the day there. And so that's how they were on that ward. And then there was the officers' ward, which was in a main building, and so they had the best ward. And so we had all the officers there. And one day we had the Earl of Harwood's son, who was an officer, and he'd been injured. And when his father came into the ward to see him, he said he'd been all over the place, and he said, and he'd been put in a mental hospital. And how did that happen? Well, he said our hospital was built in the grounds of the mental hospital, and he'd asked one of the gardeners, where the officer's ward was, and he'd taken him into the mental hospital. One of the mental patients who'd taken him into there. And he told him that he'd be looked after there, he'd be all right.
And what year did you leave the hospital?
1946. And of course, that first convoy, when we all got back into the nurses, into our sleeping quarters, I and lying there, we were all exhausted. And I just suddenly realised it would have been my wedding day. It should have been the happiest day of my life. And it was one of the saddest days of my life, seeing all these injured men. Well, my fiancé was, I didn't know where he was at the time. He was he was a petty officer in the Royal, the Fleet Air Arm. At that time, he'd been called up, into the forces. And the week before we'd arranged to get married, he was sent away. We didn't know where he was. I didn't hear from him for about a couple of weeks, and then found he had just a short note from Africa, where he ended up for the whole of the war. He was working, because he was a male nurse as well, and he was working in a hospital in Mombasa, assisting the flying doctor and the witch doctor. And we got married. 5 years later, he was away for 5 years.
Did you send or receive any letters from him?
Not once, no. I'd better tell him where we met. I said he was the lecturer in the St John Ambulance Brigade. He was sort of superintendent of the St John Ambulance. And we used to meet at the first aid post. This was just before the war, the year before the war. And we were having lectures every week. And there were 2 doctors lecturing as well. And the one doctor asked if I'd like to go and see a post-mortem, as he knew I was training as a nurse. And so he took me to this mortuary, which was in the next village called Brown Hills. And it was a shed in the middle of the dustbins, all the dustbin lorries, and that was the mortuary. And when we went in, we just got there, and there was an air raid. The sirens went, and there was 2 doctors and myself, And then the other man came in, and this happened to be Albert, my husband eventually, and he was lecturing as well. We stood watching the two doctors doing their work on the body that was in the mortuary, and the sirens went. There was an air raid. All the lights failed, and we got candles because there were candles everywhere at that time, and so the doctors carried on with their work as we held Albert and I had a candle each, and we stood one each side of the body, and there was just the candle light for the doctors to be working on the body, and it was such an eerie light in this little shed, and we looked into each other's eyes and fell in love.
As romantic settings go, I'm not sure you can beat that.
Well, that's quite true, quite true.
Amazing, Ethel, amazing. Thank you for sharing that with us. That's incredible.
The only time I'd spoken to him was when I was in the first aid class, learning how to do bandages and knots and things. And so he said he would take me home on his motorbike. And so he lived in the next village to me. Every time there was an air raid, you see, we used to go to the first aid post, everybody who was connected with it. And when the sirens went, I would jump. I lived in one village, so I had to jump out of bed, put my siren suit on, and wait on the corner for him. And I'd hear his motorbike start up from his house in the next village, and be ready to go to the first aid post. and only then, after that, he offered to take me to a fair in Walsall, which was only there like once a year. And that was our only date, really. And then the next week he was called up.
Goodness me.
He had about, he came on leave about 3 times before he was sent somewhere else, And so that was when we arranged we'd get married almost immediately, really. And but before I had my wedding dress and everything all ready, the little chapel booked. The week before we were going to get married, he was sent abroad without any leave. So it was five years before we met each other again. Oh, well, for the first fortnight we didn't hear anything. And he lived with his widowed mother, and then she had a telegram saying that he was alive. He'd been saved. It displeased. He was on a ship, didn't know where he was going, and he was torpedoed. But he'd been saved because I told you he was a male nurse. He'd been working with the doctor in a little cabin on the ship and with a patient, and they were the only 3 that were saved from that journey onto another ship, which in the end ended up in Africa.
Good Lord!
And I've still got some letters from him that he sent during the war, and I say he worked with the Flying Doctor and the Witch Doctor, and I was in at Burntwood all the time.
Ethel, this is absolutely extraordinary, incredible. Oh, goodness me. Did you treat soldiers throughout the war?
Oh yes, we had all of them from there. I was there all that time, and we had on different wards. We didn't always stay on the same ward, and with the mental hospital being in the same grounds, they used to have concerts and dances and things there, and we could take our patients across the grounds. In wheelchairs. They're the ones who were good. They're right. And we'd take them into the mental hospital to see a film. I always remember I saw the first Phantom of the Opera film there. And then sometimes we used to put on shows for them, doing the can-can and all the men all the mental patients used to sit in rows at the beginning of this big hall, and our patients would be at the back, you see. And all the men shouting and clapping when we were doing the can-can. We started to have lectures, because most of us weren't properly trained nurses, you see. So they were putting lectures on for us to carry on with our education. But we kept getting interrupted by air raids, and then we'd have to leave straight away and go back to our own hospital. So they stopped all those. You know, we used to have quite a lot to do with the mental hospital, and then taking the patients. And then one night, November the 15th, 1940, I think it was, we could hear the planes going over. Yes, because the German planes, they had a sort of heavy sound. You could always tell the sound of the German planes different to our own. And this one night we heard them, you know, crowds of them going over us. We thought they were on the way to Birmingham, but they were on the way to Coventry that night. And of course, if we stood near the door, we could see outside. We watched the sky turning red, and the sky was red all over. We didn't actually know where it was then, but then, of course, the next day we found out Coventry Cathedral had gone. So that was. And another thing about being in the huts, there's 7 huts in a row, and there was a road in between, and next to all the huts was a farm, and of course all the fields were there for the farm, the other side of the hospital. And every night, if nurses were on night duty, you'd see them creeping out after matron's last visit for the night. You know, she said, no, nobody else would be around. And quite often there were only 2 or 3 nurses on duty, and you'd see them, you know, creeping out at the door, looking around, see nobody was about, hopping off down the road to where we could get into the field. And just inside the field there was what do you call a potato camp, you know, potatoes buried in soil, you know, making a bank all the way along. And all the nurses, they'd have either a knife or a spoon or something, and dig out a couple of potatoes for whoever many was on duty, and take them back to the ward. And because we got a kitchen, and you cook the potatoes in the ward. And matron never found out, I don't think. And but that happened almost every night, and we'd be stealing these potatoes out of the camp. And another funny thing that used to happen at night, well, not just at night, but in the afternoon, all the men were supposed to rest. You know, even though if they could sit out of bed, they would. If not many of them could get up. But they'd get in bed, and they'd got the sheets over their head. And when I first went on day duty to saw this, I thought, whatever are they doing, you know? And so, of course, I said, you know, what's happening? And they said, oh, don't tell anybody, you know. And then I could hear them shouting to one another. And they were playing bingo, and it was illegal in those days, and I don't know why it was illegal. So they had to cover up under the bedclothes, so if anybody came in the ward, they wouldn't know what they were doing. I think they were all very ill with the sheets over their heads. But another thing about the wards as well, some of them were really very ill, and a lot of them were dying, and we were allowed to have the radio on for the news now and again, and always after the news there'd be music, messages for home from Vera Lynn, and she would sing. And I always say, when I went to Dunkirk, I told them about this. They couldn't believe it. And I think she did more for the morale of the men, for the whole of the war, really, because all her songs meant something to them, And you'd sometimes see, perhaps, because most of them were only 18 or 19, all the soldiers, and you see the young boys, 18 years old, the same as I was, and crying for the mothers, and Vera's voice would come on, and immediately, there was silence in the ward. It meant such a lot to them. When I was in Dunkirk, and I had to give an after-dinner speech, and I told them about this, and afterwards I was followed by reporters from the Belgium and the French, wanting to know more about her. And she's still alive.
Yes, she's still with us, yeah.
103 years. And I said the only thing I've always ever wanted was to meet her, and I never have.
Thank you so much for speaking to me, Ethel. I can't get over the story of you meeting your husband.
Yeah, well, the doctors went on with their work. You see, we stood one each side of the body. It was a lady, actually. And I said we looked into each other's eyes. But, and of course, we had to wait 5 years before we could get married, and we were getting married on his first leave. I was getting married at a little chapel where I lived in Sheffield. I've got all the wedding photographs, and I've got all my wedding dress and everything, four bridesmaids and a little page boy. And of course they'd all been packed away for 5 years, but we managed to get on with them. Yeah, and so we got there, and when we got to the little chapel, it was absolutely packed. People were standing outside, and all the neighbours in the village had offered food. Well, rationing, you see, so they'd offered food and that. But there was a coach outside, and I thought, well, I don't know why that is, but I'd worked a 12-hour shift, come off duty in the morning, and all the patients had said goodbye to me and given me a table lamp as a wedding present. And when I got to the little chapel, there was this coach there, and all the ones who could walk had come to see me married. We paid 7 and 6 for the the marriage licence, and my mother was a nurse in the First World War. That's why I always wanted to be a nurse, and she had booked a honeymoon for us. Because it was 1945, 10th of March. The war hadn't finished, but we went to Llandudno, we got there all right and stayed with Mother's friends there for a week. But when we got there, the beach was barricaded, and of course we had to stay in this little guest house, and the pier was cut in half, and then on the way back, we went by train, and on the way back we had to go from Llandudno to London, and when we got there, the station was on fire. The ceiling and the platforms were all on fire, and it was the V2s still dropping. That was 1945, you see, and so. Instead of getting home the one night, we didn't get home till the next morning.
Well, thank you. Thank you again, Ethel, and goodbye.